Joe Biden, the President of the United States, gave a speech in Warsaw. Earlier in the day, President Putin had given a speech in Moscow. But the speech that Biden gave, it wasn't like a riposte or anything like that. It was a standalone speech, although obviously dealing with the same matter, which is Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine. He started off by saying that obviously the peace has been shattered, broken. It's lasted for 75 years since the end of World War II in 1945. He was obviously just referring to Europe, the peace in Europe, because there's been numerous other conflicts, wars all over since World War II. The main ones that the United States and some of the other European countries were involved with was obviously Korea in the early 50s, Vietnam 60s through to early 70s, Iraq in the 90s and the early 2000s, and Afghanistan. But it's a fair point, and the point he was making was that you would have expected Europe and European countries to be able to have dealt with a dispute without it ending in hostilities. He said freedom, and this was just, his speech was peppered with freedom. It just at every turn, freedom, 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 freedom. I suppose it's a evocative word, and it's like one of those admin things like new or improved. It's one of these words which has stood the test of time. He says the test, though, for Ukraine and the world and is all democracies are now being tested. All democracies are being tested because they need to show that they're strong and they're not weak, and that they're not going to look the other way and just walk on by, basically. And he says that the United States didn't look the other way, and the Europeans and lots of other countries didn't look the other way, and they stood strong, and they all pulled together to help out the Ukrainians. He didn't mention the other countries in the world which are not ostensibly backing Ukraine, because although a lot of countries are, it's not universal. But you would expect them only to hit on in press the major points, the points that he wants to get across. The point he was trying to get across, I think, was that the European countries and the United States, they didn't look the other way. They came and they supported Ukraine. What he doesn't mention is any involvement that the United States had prior to the kickoff of the main hostilities. Because I think President Biden and most of the other Western leaders want to set the start as being the day that Russia forces went into eastern Ukraine. They've they don't want any mention, and they never mention any mention prior to that. They don't mention the conflict that was going on in the Donbass region for 8 and 9 years. They don't mention the bloodshed. They don't mention the loss of life on both sides, on the Ukrainian and on the separatists, if you revolutionaries, whatever you want to term that you want to use. The people in the Donbass area that perhaps wanted more autonomy from Ukraine. That's not mentioned. It's like year zero, day zero is 24th of February. That's it. Nothing gets mentioned prior to that. I think he does a disservice to himself and to the other Western leaders by trying to admit that. I think there's a different level between the 9 years, the sort of border fighting, skirmishes, although there was artillery used, and the level of intensity, the drones, the strikes, the heavy artillery, the widespread bombardments of places. I think it is a disservice because I think if your truth is strong enough, you should be able to show the whole truth and not just be totally selective. Understand the reasons why he's trying to make his argument stronger. I personally think it makes it weaker. But to anyone that hasn't perhaps done their own research, looked at these things, it sounds like before the 24th of February 2022, everything was peace and light. It was just idyllic in Ukraine, and whoosh, it all kicked off from there. It says the principles of sovereignty and democracy. He mentions democracy, freedom, democracy, all over and over again, virtually in every few paragraphs, lines, whatever. It says everybody's got to stand up for democracy no matter what. So like democracy is at the top here, freedom's even higher than democracy, and the Western countries are prepared to stand up for it. And democracy is too strong. You can't beat democracy. And then he tried for like a word play, and I don't think it came off. He said something along the lines of Finlandia has been NATO, but NATO's been Finland, and it was something like that. It was like a juxtaposition, play on words with Finland and NATO. Finlanded or something. It did, to me, didn't come off. I didn't think it came off to the people that were there. But bearing in mind that it's in Poland, how many of the people could speak English? Possibly a reasonable number. But I thought it was a wee bit too tricky, and he didn't bring it off. It wasn't tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev, or Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. As far as I could tell, in that speech, there was no zinger. There was no little bite which it'll be remembered for. Went on about the energy and how they work together to overcome the energy shortfall now that the Western countries have sanctioned Russia and they won't buy the gas and the oil. He didn't mention that, just basically said that they're working together to overcome it. There was no mention of the big pipelines and how, why, and whom could have possibly taken these out of the game and why they were. That was not mentioned at all. He's basically saying that sort of like dictators and people like that aren't really strong. And then when they've come up against a strong adversary, like America and the American people, they've sort of balked, and it's slowed them down. Back to democracy again, and what democracy stands for. The democracies are not weaker. What we stand for, who we stand for, and more importantly, not only what we stand for, but who stands with you. And I thought that was quite a strong line. I think if he had repeated that somewhere else, I think it had a sticking power. You know, it's not so much what you stand for; it's who you stand with. I thought it had the makings of a zinger on the speech. He said the solidarity, same again. It's like a retread. Solidarity. We're all in this together. Mentioned Moldova. I think Moldova is on south of Ukraine, kind of like a little bit away from the Black Sea. He's stating that Russia's got ambitions to annex, take over, land grab. Use whichever term you feel comfortable with. He says that the democracies in Ukraine, you know, Russia doubted that the democracies had staying power. He's basically, between the lines, saying that the thought was the Russians thought that the democracies are weak. You know, they've got soft, they haven't got the staying power. I think that can perhaps be, if you want to try and link it back to some of the other conflicts that America has been in and how the conflicts have ended. Most countries, not just the United States, don't want to be in long, drawn-out conflicts. In Vietnam, you know, they were in Vietnam for, 12 years or something like that. By the time Vietnam got to the early 70s and stuff like that, I think the bulk of America was pig sick of Vietnam and the conflict and the number of poor American lads that had lost their lives out there. Primarily President Johnson, who was like a war hawk in it. Kicked off with Kennedy. I think it had actually kicked off with Eisenhower with a few advisors. Kennedy had bumped it up to a couple of thousand or whatever. But it was Johnson that really wellied into it and sent the hundreds and tens and hundreds of thousands of troops. I haven't been to Washington. It's a place in the United States I've never been to. I've been to some of the places in the South. I've been to some of the presidential libraries. I've never been to Washington, but I've seen the clips in the photos of the big black wall with all of the American service personnel's names written in. It's not what you want. It's not what any country wants.